There is a teaching among the ancient Jewish sages that most of the world completely ignores. You won't find it taught in Ivy League universities. It doesn't appear in modern finance textbooks, and you will never hear it mentioned in a standard entrepreneurship course. Yet it has built more fortunes from absolute scratch than any algorithm on Wall Street. And the most unsettling part? It begins with something that has absolutely nothing to do with money. It begins with humiliation. According to the ancient sages, before the floodgates of true abundance can open, something inside you has to break. Something old, something false, something you thought you were, but never actually belonged to you. And sometimes life uses the person who hurts you the most to shatter it. This is the story of a man who had nothing. In fact, he had less than nothing. He carried a mountain of debt, a crushing weight of shame, and a father-in-law who looked at him the way you look at a stray dog that just tracked mud all over a clean carpet. But he also had something else, a strange pattern, a sequence of numbers that began appearing on receipts, digital clocks, utility bills, and license plates. A number that chased him like a shadow masquerading as a message, 111. But we will get to that in a moment. First, you need to meet the man whom the world had written off before he even had a chance to live. In the freezing winter of 1996, in a fading blue-collar town just outside of Youngstown, Ohio, lived a 33-year-old man named Robert Vance. Robert was married to a wonderful woman named Lucy. Lucy happened to be the daughter of Big Frank Miller, the owner of the largest hardware and supply store in the county. Big Frank was a massive man with a thick neck, a voice like thunder, and opinions that absolute defied argument. He was the kind of man who measured a human being's worth solely by the size of their bank account. And by that metric, Robert was worth zero. Robert had tried everything. He opened a small convenience store that lasted exactly 8 months before going under. He tried selling liquidation pallets at the local weekend flea market. He worked as a personal driver for a corrupt local politician who paid him late and treated him like dirt. He even tried raising backyard chickens for organic eggs, but a sudden disease wiped out the entire flock in a single week. Every single project ended the exact same way, in a loss, and every loss added another line of numbers to a spiral notebook he kept hidden in his dresser drawer, buried beneath his socks. To make matters worse, the house they lived in belonged to Big Frank. They didn't pay rent, it was a favor. And Big Frank made sure Robert never forgot it. Every Sunday, when the entire family gathered at the father-in-law's estate, Big Frank would look down from the head of the table, lock eyes with Robert, and drop casual daggers. Some people are built to build empires, Robert, and others are just weeds taking up space in the garden. At this rate, my grandkids are going to inherit your overdraft fees. If you had gone to trade school or done something useful with your life, we'd be singing a different tune. Lucy would look down at her plate. Robert would grip his fork until his knuckles turned white. His brothers-in-law would suddenly find their steaks incredibly fascinating. Nobody said a word, because in that house, Big Frank was the law. But the most painful part wasn't the words. It was that, deep down, Robert believed his father-in-law was right. Every failure confirmed the narrative. He was useless, a daydreamer without execution, a provider who couldn't provide. That belief had settled so deeply into his bones that he didn't even question it anymore. It was as much a part of him as his own name. Lucy loved him. He never doubted that. But love doesn't pay the electric bill. She watched her husband slowly dim month after month. He stopped talking at dinner. He avoided driving through the center of town because he owed money to 3 different local shops and the pharmacy. He would just sit on the back porch chair, staring into the gray Ohio sky for hours without saying a single word. By December of that year, Robert owed money to half the town. He literally owed the butcher, the local mechanic, the childhood friend who lent him cash for the chicken coop, and a small-time predatory loan company whose interest rates grew like toxic weeds. The total sum was a number Robert couldn't even bring himself to say out loud. He would look at it at night while Lucy slept, feeling the weight of those digits pressing down on his chest like concrete. One freezing night in December, Robert couldn't sleep. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lucy, and walked into the dark kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. There was almost nothing inside. A carton with a splash of milk, 2 eggs, a plate of leftover beans wrapped in foil. He closed the door. He poured himself a glass of tap water, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared ahead under the harsh glare of a single exposed bulb. He glanced up at the plastic wall clock. The hands pointed exactly to 11:11. Robert stared at it blankly, drank his water, and went back to bed. But the next morning, when he turned on the old radio in the garage while trying to fix a broken space heater, the radio host's voice cut through the static. "Checking the clock. It is exactly 11:11 a.m. on this chilly Thursday." Robert stared at the radio as if it had spoken to him personally. He shook his head. Just a coincidence. But it wasn't. Because 111 began tracking him down. His receipt at the gas station came out to exactly $11.11. A past due notice that arrived in the mail had a tracking number ending in 1111. The local access television channel that stayed frozen on a blue screen when the signal dropped. Channel 11, the address of a warehouse where he went to apply for a manual labor job, was 111 North Main Street. A delivery truck that nearly clipped his bumper at an intersection had a license plate starting with 11 and ending in 11. Robert wasn't mystical. He wasn't superstitious. He went to church on Sundays because Lucy dragged him there. But he wasn't a man of deep spiritual faith. He was practical, grounded, the kind of guy who only believed in what he could see and touch. But this was getting relentless. It felt like someone tapping him on the shoulder over and over again. But every time he turned around, no one was there. He tried to force it out of his months and focus on survival. He walked from factory to factory in the next town over, wearing his least wrinkled shirt, holding a plastic folder with his resume. At the first place, they told him they weren't hiring. At the second, they told him they'd keep his application on file. They never called. At the third, the hiring manager looked at his employment gaps, smirked, and said, "Aren't you a little old to be looking for entry-level floor work?" Robert walked back to the bus stop with his jaw clenched and his eyes burning. He didn't cry. He wouldn't let himself. but something inside him shrank even further. Before we look at what happened next, I want to pause for a second. I know that on YouTube, it's easy to just watch a video and completely forget to hit that subscribe button. But if you're listening to this story right now and you've already subscribed and liked this video, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It takes days to uncover these lessons, write them with care, and produce these videos for you. Your support means more than you know. Thank you. Now, let's get back to the story, because what happens next changes everything. One freezing Sunday evening, right after another brutal family dinner where Big Frank announced to the table that even the neighbor's mule produces more than my son-in-law, Robert walked out of the house. His chest was burning, not with anger, but with agreement. A toxic voice inside him whispered, "He's right. You're nothing." He walked aimlessly through the quiet streets. The sun was setting, casting long, cold shadows. He passed the town square, the church, the closed-up shops, and kept walking until he reached an old, forgotten industrial sector of town, a street filled with abandoned brick buildings and boarded-up windows. There, wedged between a defunct auto repair shop and a barber shop with its metal shutters halfway down, was a storefront he had never noticed before. A small wooden sign hung crookedly over the door, "Books and Antiques." The door was cracked open an inch. A warm amber light spilled onto the icy pavement. Robert pushed the door open. He had no idea why he was entering. He didn't have $1 to spend on a book, but something pulled him forward. It wasn't a logical thought. It was a primal instinct, like a thirsty animal tracking water without knowing why. The shop was small, smelling deeply of old paper, leather, and cedar. The walls were lined with towering shelves, overflowing with unorganized books. Cardboard boxes littered the floor alongside stopped grandfather clocks and empty antique frames. Behind a massive dark oak desk covered in loose papers sat an old man. He was incredibly old, thin, wearing a black velvet kippah on his head, round wire glasses, and a long white beard that cascaded down to his chest. He was reading a heavy leather-bound volume. He didn't look up when Robert walked in. Robert quietly walked through the narrow aisles, looking at the spines of the books. Some were in English, others were in a language he couldn't comprehend, letters that looked like intricate drawings written from right to left. Hebrew. Minutes passed. The old man remained motionless, reading. Robert felt an awkward knot form in his stomach. He turned to leave, but just as his hand touched the doorknob, the old man spoke without lifting his eyes from the page. "How much do you owe?" Robert froze. "I'm sorry?" The old man raised his head for the first time. His eyes were dark, incredibly deep, and nested within a face carved by time. "You have the face of a man who owes a lot and holds very little. How much do you owe?" For reasons Robert would never fully understand, he answered with the exact, raw truth. Perhaps because a stranger can safely hold the truths we hide from the people we love. He named the total debt. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He simply nodded slowly. "Sit down." Robert grabbed a simple wooden chair near the wall, dragged it over to the desk, and sat. The old man closed the heavy book, placed his hands flat on the desk, and looked at him. I am going to tell you something my father told me when I had nothing, and his father told him, and his father's father before that. It is a teaching that has passed through generations of our people for centuries. Robert didn't blink. We have been driven out of more countries than you can count, the old man said softly. They took our homes, our land, our businesses, our money, and our documents. They left us in the streets with nothing but the clothes on our backs. And yet, in every single country, in every single generation, we rebuilt from absolute scratch. Do you know why? Robert shook his head. Because the only thing they can never take from you is what you know. And what we know, what we are taught from the time we are children, is that money is not an object. Money is energy, and energy responds to laws. Not luck, not inheritances, not connections. Laws. Robert leaned in. What laws? The old man raised one finger. One, the first law, Shefa, the divine flow. The first law is Shefa, the constant divine flow of abundance that descends from above. It never stops. It has never stopped since the creation of the world. The problem is not that the universe isn't sending abundance. The problem is that you have clogged the pipe. How do you clog it? Robert asked. With your words, with your beliefs, with what you say about yourself when no one is listening. Every time you say, I can't, I don't have, I am a failure, you are placing a massive plug in the channel. The Shefa keeps coming, but it cannot enter your life because you have sealed the entrance. Robert instantly thought of Big Frank's words. He thought of his own internal monologue, the spiral notebook, the daily ritual of telling himself he was a loser. Every single one of those thoughts was a plug, and he had been sealing that pipe for years. The old man raised a second finger. 2. The second law, Kli, the vessel. The second law is the Kli, the vessel. It is not enough for the channel to be open. You must possess a container large enough to hold what falls. Do you know what expands the vessel? Robert shook his head. 2 things, gratitude and generosity. When you express genuine gratitude for the tiny bit you do have, your vessel expands. When you give, even when you think you have nothing, the vessel expands even more. Poor minds believe that giving is losing. The wise know that giving is expanding your capacity to receive. This is why our tradition teaches tithing from youth. Not because God needs your money, God needs nothing, but because your soul needs to give in order to grow its capacity. Robert frowned. But if I literally have nothing, how am I supposed to give? The old man smiled. It was a weary, ancient smile, but filled with an undeniable warmth. If you have 2 slices of bread, you can give away 1. If you have a free hour, you can use it to help a neighbor. If you have a skill, you can use it to serve someone who is hurting. Giving is not about currency. Giving is about flow. And when you flow, the Shefa recognizes you as an open channel and directs more through you. He raised a third finger. 3. The third law, Koach Hadibur, the power of speech. The third law is the most critical. Koach Hadibur, the power of the spoken word. Every word that exits your lips is a seed. That is not a metaphor, it is a metaphysical law. When you speak, "I am poor," you are decreeing poverty. When you speak, "I am abundant," you are decreeing abundance. Words create worlds. Words destroy worlds. The scriptures say the universe was created with 10 utterances, 10 phrases. If reality was spoken into existence, what kind of reality do you think you are creating with your daily complaints? The silence in the bookstore became incredibly heavy. Robert could hear the faint ticking of a clock in the corner. "But there is a catch," the old man whispered. "It is not enough to just mouth the words. You must feel them. You must assume they are already your reality. Not tomorrow. Now. You must step into the frequency of a man who is already prosperous, already capable, already clear of debt, even when your physical eyes see the exact opposite, because outer reality is merely an echo of inner reality, and echoes always travel with a delay. What you see outside today is the result of what you believed yesterday. If you want to alter what you see tomorrow, you must change what you believe right now." Robert sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "What about the number? The 111?" The old man tilted his head, a knowing look passing through his eyes. "You see it everywhere? Every day?" "Yes." The old man nodded. The number 1 is the digit of absolute unity, the source. When you see it repeated, it is a sign of maximum alignment, not of heaven aligning with you, but of you finally aligning with your true self. It is the universe knocking on your shoulder whispering, "You are ready to begin again, but this time, build it from the inside out." When Robert walked out of the shop, the night had grown pitch black. The winter air smelled of wood smoke and crisp frost. He walked home slowly. Lucy was asleep. He went out to the back porch, sat down on the cold chair, looked up at the stars, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't count his debts. He counted his possibilities. The next morning, before the sun even cleared the horizon, Robert did something he had never done. He walked out to the backyard, stood before the gray morning sky, and whispered into the cold air, "I am abundance. I am capable. I am a provider for my family. The Shefa flows through me." He felt completely ridiculous. Big Frank's booming voice immediately echoed in his mind, "Are you losing your mind?" But the old man's words cut through the doubt. Outer reality is merely an echo of inner reality. He did it the next day, and the day after that. Every single morning, before anyone else woke up, he stood on that porch, staring at the sky, decreeing his reality, even though nothing around him had changed. The first week, absolutely nothing happened. The second week, the same. On the third week, Sunday dinner arrived, and Big Frank delivered another round of humiliation. "So, Robert, did you finally look for a real job, or are you still waiting for manna to fall from heaven?" The brothers-in-law chuckled. Lucy bit her lip. But this time, instead of shrinking into his seat, something shifted inside Robert. A quiet, ironclad voice inside him rose up. "This man has no idea who I am, but I am finally finding out." He didn't fire back an angry response. He just looked directly at Big Frank and held his gaze. Something in Robert's posture Something in his eyes had completely changed. Big Frank noticed it. For a split second, a flash of pure discomfort crossed the old man's face, as if he had just spotted a wolf sitting where a sheep used to be. By the fourth week, Robert began applying the second law, the kli, the vessel. He didn't have money to give, but he had 2 hands and he had time. He walked 3 blocks over to the house of Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived alone. Her back porch door had been warped by the humidity and hadn't closed properly for months, letting the freezing winter wind howl straight into her kitchen. Robert spent an hour fixing it. He sanded down the swollen wood, tightened the rusted hinges, and fashioned a solid new latch out of some heavy wire he found. He didn't charge her a single dime. Mrs. Gable looked at him with misty eyes and handed him a warm plate of homemade beef stew and fresh cornbread. It tasted like grace. A few days later, very early in the morning, he saw the town baker struggling completely alone to unload massive, heavy sacks of flour from the back of a delivery truck. The baker was an elderly man, sweating and gasping for air in the freezing cold. Without a word, Robert crossed the street. He hoisted the heavy sacks onto his shoulders one by one and carried them all into the back storage room of the bakery. When they finished, the baker tried to hand him cash, but Robert refused. The baker instead pressed a large bag of fresh pastries into his hands and said, "God bless you, Robert." Robert smiled. He wasn't doing it for the pastries or even for the blessing. He was doing it because he couldn't stop thinking about what the old sage had told him. When you flow, the Shefa recognizes you as an open channel. Giving wasn't a loss. Giving was expanding the container. And beneath the surface of his life, an old rusted gear had finally begun to turn. Change didn't hit like a lightning bolt. It arrived the way the temperature changes right before dawn, so subtle that you don't even notice it until suddenly you realize you aren't freezing anymore. The baker happened to mention Robert to a close friend of his, a man who owned a massive construction lumber yard in the next city over. If you need someone reliable, hard-working, and honest for weekend deliveries, call Robert Vance, the baker had said. That guy will lift anything without a single complaint, and he'll show up before you even open your doors. The yard owner needed weekend help. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady income. Robert took it instantly. While making those weekend deliveries to various job sites, Robert started noticing a massive pattern. The clients buying lumber and drywall were constantly asking the same question: "Do you know a reliable local contractor or crew who can handle a small drywall job, a quick porch repair, a basement remodel?" The demand was overwhelming, but no one was filling the gap. The major construction firms in the area only took 6-figure commercial contracts, and Big Frank's hardware store had the local contractors completely monopolized for his own high-end builds. One night, sitting on his back porch and looking up at the sky, an idea hit Robert. It wasn't a massive, complicated corporate strategy. It was pure intuition, a warm electric current vibrating in his chest. He didn't need to build the houses himself. He just needed to connect the clients from the lumber yard with the underemployed independent tradesmen he knew throughout the county. He didn't need to be the builder. He could be the bridge. He could organize, coordinate, and project manage the jobs that were too small for the big corporations but too complicated for a single homeowner to figure out. He checked his watch. It was exactly 11:11 p.m. He smiled. The number didn't startle him anymore. It felt like a silent green light from the universe whispering, "Keep moving." Robert didn't have capital to launch a business. He had no office, no corporate line, nothing. But he possessed something far more powerful than a bank loan, an absolute, unshakable certainty that he was no longer the man he used to be. He opened his old spiral notebook, the very same one that held his list of debts. But he flipped past the pages of red ink to the clean white pages at the back. He began writing down a different kind of data. Names of local drywallers, carpenters, painters, client numbers, material costs, and project timelines. He negotiated a deal with the owner of the lumber yard. For every client Robert brought in to buy materials, the yard would grant him a small percentage commission. The first month, he made very little. But what he did make didn't vanish. For the first time in his life, the money didn't leak out through an emergency. No pipes burst, no cars broke down, no mysterious bills appeared. The money stayed, as if it had finally found a home that was ready to welcome it. By the second month, his income doubled. Word of mouth was spreading like wildfire. Call Robert Vance. He'll get you the crew, he'll source the materials, and he actually shows up when he says he will. He treated everyone with profound respect, the client and the manual laborer alike. In a blue-collar town where subcontractors were used to being exploited, Robert's honesty was revolutionary. By the third month, his operation outgrew the spiral notebook. He bought a professional leather planner, organized his workers into dedicated teams, negotiated wholesale pricing with 2 more supply yards, and began taking a formal management fee for every project he oversaw. He wasn't anyone's employee anymore. He was the bridge between a problem and a solution, and the world always pays handsomely for a bridge. Lucy was the very first person to notice the shift. It wasn't just the money arriving on the kitchen counter, it was the aura around her husband. He was sleeping through the night. He spoke with absolute clarity. He looked people dead in the eye instead of staring at the floor. One evening she sat next to him, took his hands, and asked, "Robert, what happened to you?" He looked at her, smiled gently, and said, "I stopped believing what your father says about me, and I started believing what I tell myself every single morning." By June of 1997, exactly 6 months after walking into that hidden antique shop, Robert had paid off over half of his total debt. Not through a stroke of luck, a lottery ticket, or a handout, but through organized, relentless action built on a foundation of internal certainty. By September, every single debt was entirely wiped out. He walked into the butcher shop, the mechanic's garage, his old friend's house, and the loan office. One by one, he laid down the exact cash owed. No drama, no excuses, just a man fulfilling his word. In October, Big Frank did something unprecedented. He invited Robert out to lunch, just the 2 of them. They sat at a quiet booth in the town's upscale steakhouse. Big Frank ate his meal in heavy silence. When he finished, he wiped his mustache with a napkin, leaned back, and looked at Robert. I'm hearing rumors that you paid off every dime you owed in this town." Robert nodded. "I did." "And I'm hearing you've got half the independent crews in the county running projects through your planner." Robert nodded again. "That's correct." Big Frank stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then he uttered a line Robert never in a million years expected to hear. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you." It wasn't a formal apology. Big Frank was not a man built for apologies, but it was the closest thing to a white flag Robert would ever receive, and it was more than enough. By December of 1997, 1 year to the day from that lonely night in the kitchen staring at the clock, Robert's business had cleared more net profit than Big Frank's hardware store generated in an entire year. Not because he was inherently smarter, not because his luck had magically turned around, but because he had mastered a truth that 99% of the population goes to their graves without ever understanding. Money is not a strategic problem. Money is a frequency problem, and you can only alter the frequency from the inside out, through your words, your assumptions, and a sustained internal certainty, even when the world outside is screaming that you're failing. That Christmas, Big Frank hosted the family dinner at his estate. The entire family sat around the massive dining table. The food was served, and Big Frank sat at the head of the table, as he always did. But the atmosphere that night was entirely different. Robert wasn't staring down at his plate. He wasn't gripping his fork in silent agony. He was completely relaxed, laughing with his children, chatting warmly with his family. When Big Frank looked down from the head of the table, searching for the shrinking, broken man he used to bully, he found something else entirely. He found a man who no longer required his validation. And to a tyrant, a man who cannot be broken is far more terrifying than any insult. After dinner, while the family watched a football game in the living room, Robert stepped out onto the dark back porch. Big Frank was already out there, quietly smoking a cigar, staring into the cold winter night. Robert walked over and stood right beside him. They stood in silence for a long minute. Then Robert spoke smoothly. "Frank, I paid you back the last dollar for the house rent 2 months ago, but I want you to know something. I don't hold a single ounce of resentment toward you. In fact, you did me a massive favor without even knowing it. Every time you told me I was nothing, you forced me to go looking for who I actually was. Your humiliation was the very door I needed to walk through." Big Frank didn't turn his head. He took a long, slow drag of his cigar, blew the smoke out into the freezing air, and whispered, "Like I said, your grandfather would have been proud." Years later, whenever young entrepreneurs would ask him for the secret to his wealth, Robert wouldn't hand them a business book. He would tell them about an old Jewish sage in a forgotten corner of Ohio, and the 3 ancient laws, Shefa, Kli, and Koach Hadibur. Open the channel, expand the vessel, guard your mouth. He spoke with the quiet ease of a man who no longer had anything to prove to anyone, and he always added one final piece of advice. Never count out a man who has absolutely nothing, because the man with nothing is the closest to receiving everything. He just needs someone to remind him who he actually is. What Robert discovered in that Rust Belt town is the exact same truth that Kabbalah masters have whispered for thousands of years. Money doesn't start in a vault. It starts in your consciousness. Poverty is not an economic bracket. It is a frequency you tune into every single time you say, I can't, I don't have, I'm not enough. And wealth is never just a number in a bank account. Wealth is the natural, inevitable shadow cast by a soul that opens its Shefa with radical gratitude, expands its Klai through quiet generosity, and treats its Koach Hadibur as if every single spoken word were a blank check signed by the Creator. Tonight, before you close your eyes, do something radical for yourself. Think about the biggest debt you currently carry. Not the financial one, the emotional one. That lingering internal voice whispering that you'll never make it. That internal father-in-law, that old boss, that past failure that keeps repeating that you aren't worth it. Look at that voice in the mirror and say with every ounce of conviction you can find, I don't believe you anymore. I am abundance. I am capable. The Shefa flows through me. It doesn't matter if you don't feel it yet. A seed doesn't require your belief to grow. It just requires you to plant it. And every single morning, you speak those words, you are watering something that will eventually bear fruit you cannot even conceive of today. Do it tomorrow. Do it the day after that, just like Robert did on a freezing porch in Ohio, with debts up to his chin and a world that despised him. He had less than nothing, but he had 3 laws, 2 hands, and an absolute refusal to speak his own misery into existence ever again. And if tomorrow or today you happen to see the number 1111 on a clock or a screen, you know exactly what it means. It is not a coincidence. It is your cue to begin again. But this time, do it from the inside out, because money was never the obstacle. The obstacle was always what you believed you deserved. And that, unlike the balance of your bank account, is completely in your hands.